bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. This is Independence Day week, I guess. The holiday is upon us where we remember the Revolution and the Constitution and independence. And so, of course, it's very appropriate that we're talking about taxes. We're joined today by a libertarian commentator, but more importantly, author of a book called How Do I Tax Thee? A Field Guide to the Great American Ripoff. Kristin Tate, that's a fantastic title. Thanks for joining us today to talk about the book and about the issue.
Hey, Connor and Brian. Thank you so much for having me on.
Let's get into it a little bit. You've been a commentator for a while. You're on Fox News. I remember you back from your Ron Paul Liberty Report days. You're very opinionated, outspoken about these ideas. Why did you decide to write a book about taxes? It seems like that's kind of a foregone conclusion that we just don't really talk about too much. We all grumble about it. What led you to write a book specifically about this, as you call it, the Great American Ripoff?
Okay, so, of course, as a libertarian or as anyone right of center would think, we all know taxes are too high. And when we have these national dialogues about taxation, we tend to really focus in on the income tax. But a few years ago, I was paying my Comcast bill, and I noticed it was just so high. I was paying, I think, $250 a month for my Comcast bill. So I called Comcast to try to get my bill down, and we agreed to, $160 per month. So I thought, okay, that's still pretty high, but it's a lot better than what I was paying before. So the next bill shows up, and it is not $160. It is $210. And I call the company back, and they say, oh, well, you are paying $160 for the services, ma'am. The other $50 per month is taxes. So that really got me thinking, well, I'm paying all these taxes on my cable bill. What are the other places that I'm paying taxes other than my income tax? And I did a little digging, and I found out that income taxes actually make up less than half of our personal tax burdens. The government finds all of these other ways to tax nearly every expense and activity that we do in our daily lives. So I wrote my book, How Do I Tax Thee?, to expose all of these different sneaky ways that not just the federal government, but state and local governments are embedding these kind of stealth taxes into our lives. And most of us don't even realize that we're paying so much money to government coffers.
That's interesting, right? Because, you think about Independence Day, you think about the Revolution and how small the tax was on tea and later on stamps. And, not only that there were few taxes, but that it was a low amount. And I don't know if, is this in your mind, is this a matter of like sensitivity or you get accustomed to it, right? Where progressively, incrementally, more taxes, higher amounts over time that we just get used to. What do you think is the disparity here where we look back at what the founding fathers kind of revolted against and rejected versus what we kind of silently are subjected to today? Why the disparity in your mind?
Well, I talk to a lot of millennials, being a millennial myself, and the attitude, at least among my generation, seems to be, well, I don't like taxes, but they're the cost we pay for living in a civilized society. And a large part of my book is actually showing people where your tax revenue goes. And oftentimes, your tax revenue does not go towards living in a civilized society. If you look at nearly any state or city budget, the number one budget item almost always is government workers' salaries and pensions. And if you look at what these people are making, they're making wildly above market salaries and pensions for similar jobs in the private sector. And of course, it's very hard for them to get fired. And each official has an army of assistants with nebulous job titles. So this is where our money's going. But what really I found interesting from my research here, and what I tried to really focus on in the book, How Do I Tax Thee?, is not necessarily sales tax or income tax, but these other ways that bureaucrats and politicians tax us without putting formal taxes up for a vote. So, of course, taxes are politically unpopular, and no politician wants to run on raising the income tax. But when politicians need more revenue for either a pet project or salaries or whatever it may be, it's much easier to create a fee and tack that fee onto something we're already paying for. For example, if you look at your cell phone bill and break down the itemized line charges, there are 5 or 6 line items in every American phone bill that are essentially taxes. It's just money being funneled into state or city or federal coffers. But again, because this is not necessarily technically a tax, they call it a fee, they don't have to put that tax up for a vote. So the point of my book was to show that, there are so many countless ways that we are really paying taxes and we don't even know about those taxes. And the ways in which those taxes are imposed on us are sneaky and dishonest. So the point of the book isn't even necessarily taxes are too high, although I would argue they are. It's that you can't really be for or against a tax when you don't know you're being taxed in the first place.
Kristen, I had a recent awakening in that I'm getting ready to renew my passport. And so for the first time, I was actually reading some of the fine print on my passport. And I consider myself a pretty aware guy. I'm trying to keep an eye on what government's doing. But as I read the words that no matter where you live in the world, if you are an American citizen, if you make a dime, Uncle Sam wants his cut of the action. And that was something I hadn't even realized. Has this attitude of, look, your money is our money on the part of government, has this always persisted, or is this something that has kind of crept into the consciousness of the public sector in just the last few generations?
Well, I think it's gotten a lot worse in the last few generations, and there are many reasons for that. One, I think, is this sort of attitude among young people that we need the government to take care of us all and we need to pay taxes to live in a civilized society. But I think another problem is our education system, right? I mean, I went through public high school and then I went to a small liberal arts school, and I never had to take one basic finance or economics course to graduate. We really ought to be pushing for some sort of at least basic finance class for all of our children, at least at the high school level, so they even know what taxes are. You'd be surprised. There are kids my age who have bachelor's degrees who really don't even know anything about taxes. They don't file their own taxes because, their employer withholds, and they're totally clueless. So I think part of the problem is education. Part of it is societal attitudes towards the role of government, and then part of it is just ignorance.
Kristen, on a previous episode, we talked to somebody about estate planning and planning your retirement and your death for protecting your assets. You have a chapter in the book about death. It's hilariously in a category of chapters you call advanced adulting, which I find humorous. Talk to us about death taxes and what your research has found there. What are you seeing in terms of this issue of death as it pertains to taxes?
Well, every time somebody dies, of course, the government wants a cut. So, if you're a family, you lose a loved one, you're already grieving, and the government makes it worse and harder for you, and they nickel and dime you every step of the way. Thankfully, most Americans are not impacted by the estate tax, but still, I mean, just navigating through these various hoops the government makes you jump through when somebody dies, and dealing with their estate is costly enough as it is. But you bring up an interesting point. I sort of chopped the book up into 3 parts to show how these burdensome taxes affect Americans at every stage of life. It's pretty much from the second you're born until the second you die, you get taxed. And a lot of these taxes are sort of embedded into our national psyche. I found in my research that every year Americans pay almost $700 billion in hidden taxes. And notice I said hidden taxes. So that's on top of income and sales taxes that we all know about. So it's kind of depressing, but the silver lining in my book is that I try to give people different tools to shift their spending habits to avoid some of these pesky taxes. And also, another interesting function of these taxes is that most of them are put in place on the state and city level. So the more local taxes are, the easier they are to get rid of if we can just make people aware of them.
Let's talk about avoidance, since you mentioned the word avoid. I know we're kind of trained to recoil in fear from that word as it's applied to taxes. I guess that's part of the national psyche too. But what are some of the common sense ways people can not pay taxes that they don't absolutely have to pay?
Well, a lot of taxes you simply cannot avoid, but some you can. For example, Philadelphia put in place a tax on sugary drinks and soda. So what we've found there is that people are buying soda outside of city lines, and that right there is sending a massive message to the city of Philadelphia, because as a result, companies located inside Philadelphia, restaurants and soda manufacturers like Coke, have seen a large drop-off in sales. They're having to lay off people. Meanwhile, businesses outside city lines, including even like supermarkets that sell soda, are seeing a surge in sales. So one thing I always tell people is if your city or town is taxing a certain item, just go across city lines and buy that item elsewhere. We've seen these kind of spending habits have a big impact, and Philadelphia now there's talk that they may even get rid of this tax because it's having such a negative impact on business. So people can make a statement with where they choose to buy certain items. Another thing we see a lot is people voting with their feet. You know, places like California that tax just about everything are hemorrhaging residents to lower tax states like Texas. Now, you know, of course, it's not practical to tell everyone, oh, just pick up and move your life to another state. But on a macro level, we are seeing these kinds of domestic migration patterns that are very much in line with tax policy. But I think the more easy thing to tell people is to just buy items that are not taxed, to send a message to your local government and be aware of what's being taxed. Because again, if you live in a small town and the tax is put in place, sometimes it just takes showing up to a town hall to get the tax revoked.
Until recently, part of that tax avoidance scheme was buying things online. But now the Supreme Court has recently ruled that states can begin imposing taxes on out-of-state internet-based companies that don't have a physical nexus, a location within their state. So obviously that's going to take a little while to get implemented, right, as state legislatures consider this new, directive they've been giving from the black-robed judges on high. But in the near future, I anticipate that those tax avoidance loopholes, buying things online to avoid the sales tax, is going to be closed off to a lot of people, right?
That's exactly right. This internet sales tax is just a scheme by state governments to collect as much tax revenue as possible. They're taking the freedom away from consumers to shop around for more favorable tax environments. So, it's also going to create huge compliance problems, right? You have like mothers creating crafts and selling them on Etsy who now have to comply with thousands of distinct sales tax jurisdictions. And of course, the big box retailers like Amazon and Walmart, they love this because they can afford to comply with the different tax jurisdictions. But when you're talking about small online retailers or online entrepreneurs, it becomes incredibly difficult and expensive. So it's a burden not just to tax-paying consumers like us, but also retailers as well, especially small retailers.
Kristen, you were talking a moment ago about the more utilitarian or functional-based approach to taxes, which is, objecting to, there's government staff and their pensions and there's all these problems, and I don't dispute any of that. I'm more interested for a moment in getting your thoughts on a quote from Thomas Jefferson I've always loved, where he says that to compel a man to furnish funds for the propagation of ideas he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. From my perspective, one of the key problems with taxation is precisely that it requires us to use a portion of our time, our energy, the production, our labor, to apply it towards as Jefferson said, the propagation of ideas that we disbelieve and abhor, to say nothing of not just idea propagation, but actual actions, right, and wars and things like this. You look back at like Henry David Thoreau objecting to the Mexican-American War, and so he hadn't paid his taxes, was thrown in jail for a night or two, and that's how we got his tract civil disobedience. What are your thoughts on taxation more generally on the basis that, while you can say, hey, look, you drive on the roads, so you pay for the roads. You use trash, you pay for trash. You use water, you pay for water. The more fee-based approach, where it's a user fee, right, you can at least say you can opt out. You can, not drive. You can not, use the city's trash can or whatever, right? Like there's an opt-out provision.
Right.
What are your thoughts here on taxation more generally, where we can't opt out and thus we are required to fund the propagation of these ideas that we may find so abhorrent?
Right. Well, it all just goes to show how vastly different our attitude is on taxation now. I mean, we really don't have the choice not to pay taxes. But what's really interesting is that bureaucrats and officials are aware at how offensive some of these taxes are. So they give them very misleading and important sounding names. And I write about this in my book. I'll give you a few examples. In every cell phone bill, there's a tax, or I guess it's technically a fee, but it acts exactly as a tax, called the 911 fee. It's in every cell phone bill. It's also in cable bills and in electric bills. Now, most consumers, when they see the 911 fee, you think to yourself, oh, well, I don't want to pay that tax, but that's probably going to something important, like some sort of emergency service. Well, guess what? The 911 fee in the vast majority of states is just money funneled into the state general fund, where it can be spent on anything. But it's given the name 911 fee because when it was implemented in the mid-1990s, officials needed some money to make some upgrades to the 911 phone systems. They made the upgrades in 2 years, but they kept that fee in place. And of course, they kept the name 911 fee because no one's going to question that revenue may be going towards something wasteful or offensive. And this is just one of many, many taxes and fees that are given extremely deceptive names so that people don't question it, that they assume the revenue is going towards something important or something critical. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have today with our tax system, is that people are unaware of how the money is being spent because often the taxes or fees are given extremely dishonest names.
Kristen, is there any way to bring the bureaucrats, or for that matter, elected officials, to heel? In that, I know there are a lot of elected officials who will plead, oh, our hands are tied. The law requires, that we assess this tax or we charge this tax. Have you found any effective strategies for, letting them know, hey, we're on to you. We'll hold you accountable next time an election rolls around?
Well, we've seen in several cities that when a tax or a fee is a direct hit on consumers and the fee is large enough, sometimes large amounts of people will revolt. In Boston, for example, they raised the price of a train ticket in the city. And again, it was just a tax. It wasn't that they raised the price of the train ticket. They basically tacked on a tax. And this made people furious because, of course, something like this is a regressive tax. It hurts people who don't have cars and ride trains the hardest. And so the people of Boston staged massive protests. And it was interesting because you kind of saw these more conservative anti-tax folks coming together with people on the left who saw these commuter taxes as regressive. And they made so much noise that the city of Boston had no choice but to remove the tax. So sometimes, yes, people can make a difference. But again, I think the real problem is that often we just simply are not aware of the taxes we pay. Every time we eat at a restaurant, ride on a plane, take a train, get drinks at the bar, go see a movie at the movie theater, every time we do almost anything, we pay taxes. But most of us just have no clue. So you can't really do anything about it if you just don't know.
Kristen, all great thoughts for this Independence Day week where we're remembering our forefathers who had much more resistance to taxes than I think we do today. I think it's good contemplation to think, why have things changed? What can we do about it? Your book is a great start, not only to bring people up to speed, but then to empower people then to say, here's some alternative ideas to pursue. Let's think about this a little differently, because I think we should. And so I applaud you for doing the book. The book is How Do I Tax Thee? A Field Guide to the Great American Ripoff. We will link to it conveniently for our listeners on the show notes page for today, societyandthestate.com/94. Kristen, thanks so much for joining us, and have a great Independence Day.
Thank you so much, Connor and Brian. Happy Independence Day, and I love the show. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.